memory. There's a lot. There's a lot of stuff to be said about this, but again, you've written about the different kinds of memory and how they affect you as a learner, and focusing on each one individually, and then again seeing the whole picture. So, can you take us through some of the different modalities that as learners?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, we tend to think that memory is one thing, right? I have a good memory, I have a bad memory, but there's like so many different kinds of memory. And I guess I would say the most important sort of categories for music performers is, so the difference between working memory and long-term memory. So long-term memory is, the stuff that you learned at some point that's, you can get out of your memory at any point. And that can be like facts, that can be events, and that can be skills, right? Yep. So long-term memory. Working memory is what your brain is holding in memory right now for you to use in some way.
Yes.
Right, exactly. And so working memory has a limited capacity, and it's very taxing, and it breaks down under pressure. So when we're performing from memory, we want to be relying on long-term memory. You're always going to be using working memory. You can't go through life never using working memory. It's always going to be there. But you want to have sort of the proportion of working memory to long-term memory, much more long-term memory coming into play when you're performing from memory, because it has unlimited storage and it doesn't really break down under pressure. So that's the first distinction.
And it leads to automated playing. So
right, exactly.
Or subconscious approach, as it were.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. So that's the first thing. And then in terms of performing from memory, we have to rely primarily on three different types of memory. What musicians tend to call muscle memory, which is not stored in your muscles, it's stored in your brain. Scientists called it procedural memory, but the memory of how to do something. So muscle memory. Aural memory, what does it sound like? What is this piece I'm playing supposed to sound like? And then what scientists call declarative memory. So what are the actual notes and rhythms and everything that's like written on the page?
Nuts and bolts of music, as it were.
Right, exactly. And most people have one of those that is their strong suit, that's like the memory that just comes most naturally to them. So for me, it's muscle memory. I've always had a very strong muscle memory, and that's stronger than my aural memory. I actually have this memory of when I was probably, I don't know, like 11 or 12, like not a little kid, but not, like older. And I was performing in a solo recital, and in the middle, I was playing from memory. In the middle of the piece, I realized that the piano was playing the music I had just played, and I was accompanying the piano. I don't know why I had not realized this before that moment, but just at that moment, I was like,
my network, maybe.
I was like, whoa, like he's playing my music. And so I started listening to the piano, and I wasn't paying any attention to myself, but I was still playing, right? Because I was relying on my muscle memory, which is unconscious, basically. And then the piano stopped playing my melody and, took over accompanying me, and I had the melody again. And I realized, and I'm still playing through all this, I realized that I had no idea actually where I was in the music, but I was still playing.
Yeah.
And so I just listened to myself. And I was like, oh, that's where I am. And then I came back to myself, but my muscle memory carried on without any conscious interference from me. So anyway, muscle memory. So for everybody, one's going to be stronger, but you need to make sure you strengthen all three. So muscle memory, aural memory, declarative memory, what are actually the notes and rhythms and everything written on the page. Because I was lucky, right? I had a breakdown in my aural memory and my declarative memory. Actually, I had no idea what was going on, but my muscle memory was still there. And, I just paid attention, I listened to myself and was like, oh, that's where I am. And then the other memories came back. But if you purposefully strengthen all three of them, so they're all equally strong, that gives you a safety net, right? At that point, I really only had my muscle memory to rely on. If that had broken down, I would have had to stop. I would have had no idea what was going on in that piece. But if all three are strong and one of them breaks down, then you have two others to rely on, right? If two of them break down, you have another one to rely on. So for me, my oral memory and my declarative memory broke down. Somehow I still had my muscle memory, but that was kind of risky.
You also mentioned something about singing what you play and oralizing a great deal. I mean, this goes into audiation and everything else, but there does seem to be a link between your kinesthetic memory and your voice itself. Is there a strong link to those two things?
Yeah, I mean, you want to have a really strong link between your auditory memory and your muscle memory. And it seems that when they look at professional musicians versus amateur musicians, it seems that there is this what's called coactivation between the auditory cortex and the motor cortex. So if you play something silently without sound, your auditory cortex is going to be active even though there's no sound. The opposite also happens. If you hear a recording of something you know how to play, then your motor cortex is going to be active even though you're not moving.
Through fMRI scans.
Exactly. Yeah, they can see this through fMRI scans. That's right. And I have a pet theory, which I don't have like definitive support for, but I was Suzuki trained as a kid, which means I was trained by ear as my first experience with the instrument. And I have noticed, and many, many, many people have noticed, that students who are trained either in the Suzuki method or jazz or folk or some tradition where your first experience with the instrument is by ear, that you're not reading music, that students who are trained by ear have a much easier time playing from memory later on. Whereas students whose first experience with the instrument is reading music often have a really difficult time playing from memory. And my pet theory is that this auditory motor coactivation starts being developed at a very young age in kids that learn by ear versus by reading. Because when you're reading, the connection that gets formed is between the motor cortex and the visual cortex.
Yes.
And then you take away the visual and you're left with motor memory, which is implicit memory. You don't necessarily have conscious access to that. And so it feels like, I don't know what I'm doing. Like, I don't know what these notes are, right? And I have found that with students who have difficulty memorizing, if they figure out music by ear every single day as part of their regular practice, they get much better at performing from memory. And I think that what's going on is that auditory motor connection, coactivation is being formed that gives them greater ease with performing from memory.
It's interesting because there does seem to be links between the language parts of the brain and what you do as a musician as well.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that's a separate thing from this, but there is a lot of overlap between language and music in the brain. That's absolutely true.
It's interesting. And also going back to, you were talking about kinesthetic awareness and, looking at the motor patterns themselves. I believe you were talking about using the wood of the bow. So you're silent bowing, I think you called it. And, but again, you're still singing the notes in your head as you're playing them. I guess a good example was that piece you did with 9 fingers, just purely pizzicato. It's a great piece, by the way.
It's so cool, isn't it?
It's fantastic playing.
It's such a cool piece.
It's in one place.
It's really fun to play. Yeah.
Yeah, stunning piece, stunning playing. But again, I guess, in the practice stages of that, you could just be using dead notes. And again, you'd be building up your kinesthetic memory as well as your auditory memory purely by singing what you're playing.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's really important to be able to sing and hear in your head what you're playing without having to do it. Right. If you can't hear it in your head, how are you going to know if you do it right or wrong? Right? Like, you have to be able to make an oral prediction of what's supposed to happen. And if you can't do that, or you can't do that very accurately, then your playing also will not be very accurate.
So you do find yourself becoming your own teacher within the practice room as well, to a certain point.
Yeah, I mean, that's another difference between athletes and musicians. Like, athletes, especially at the elite level, they're having a session with their coach like every day, right? They're going to practice with their coach every day. Whereas with music, you see your teacher an hour once a week, right? And then the rest of the time you are totally left to your own devices. Yeah. And so, yeah, learning how to teach yourself and be your own teacher and listen to yourself in the way that your teacher is listening to you is an absolutely critical skill for musicians, because we have to do it by ourselves. And that's very different from what athletes do.
Oh, very much so. Okay, well, let's move on to deliberate practice, because you did mention that. So first of all, the study that Ericsson did in 1993 seemed to have sparked off a whole course of looking at what happens in detail, what people go through in the practice room. Can you tell us something about deliberate practice and what that actually means?
Right. Yeah. So what deliberate practice means, boiled down in a nutshell, is working on your weaknesses, is really being very sort of focused and picky with yourself. And for musicians, hearing, okay, what is not working, what doesn't sound right? What doesn't match what I want? That assumes you want something. There's this famous story of Leon Fleischer saying, this assumes you want something, right? So you have to have a clear sense of what you are aiming for. And then...
So we're going back to our goals and our plan and our structure. And yeah.
Exactly. And then you have to sort of chip away at that and get what actually comes out of your instrument to match closer and closer to what you envision in your head. And you have to be working on your weaknesses. Another important facet of deliberate practice that often gets left out of the conversation is the importance of having feedback from an expert. Ericsson was really adamant about this, actually, that deliberate practice is not deliberate practice if you don't have a teacher. Because if you can do this kind of purposeful practice, he calls it, on your own, of, attacking your weaknesses and stuff. But if you are not getting feedback and input from an expert in your field, which most of the time is a teacher or a coach, you're not going to achieve the same level of performance, because they just have a body of knowledge that you as a beginner don't have, right? Yeah. And so the role of the teacher is also really important in deliberate practice.
Yeah, I can see that, because as again, being your own teacher, you might notice X and Y, and something's wrong with Z and you're not quite sure. And then your teacher is going to say, well, if you practice this and work it this way, then this is going to solve your problem.
Exactly. Well, and he also talks a lot about the importance of mental representation. So this is, accumulated knowledge that you've kind of chunked together into larger pieces of knowledge. So as an example of like a mental representation, wherever you have lived for a long time, you have a good mental representation of where different stores are and the easiest way to get from, your house to the various places you may need to go. You don't have to consult a map, right? You just know, and oh, well, if it's 3:00 on a Tuesday, you have to use this other route because, school gets out right there and there's this big traffic jam. So you have to go around this way, right? Somebody that moves to your town, they don't know any of those things, right? So they're going to have to check a map. They're going to run into traffic. Whereas if they just asked you who's lived there, you tell them, oh yeah, take this route. That's the fastest way to get there. When you are learning something new, you don't know those sort of shortcuts. You don't have that big overarching mental representation. And so you're going to spin your wheels and waste a lot of time trying to figure out these things that an expert knows sort of instantly. Sometimes I will have students who've been struggling all week with something, and they're like, oh my gosh, I can't do this. Why? And I make one small tweak to something they're doing with one finger on their bow hand, and it solves the whole issue, because I can see very clearly, this thing you're doing with your first finger on your bow is causing this whole host of issues, because I understand how the whole thing works together.
Of course. Because
I have more experience, right? And that's where a teacher comes in.
And it's being an outside observer, not being able to see the wood for the trees, that sort of thing.
Right.
Yeah. Another thing they say about deliberate practice is, it's got to be difficult and very taxing, which makes sense. But it also seems to me that even though it's taxing and difficult, and you have to go through all these hurdles, as it were, there should be a certain amount of enjoyment within practice, because that in itself is going to change the brain chemistry in your favor and enhance learning and motor skills.
Yeah, I love to practice. It's one of my favorite things to do because it's problem solving, and I enjoy problem solving. I find it a creative act, and when you solve the problem, you feel really good, right? Yeah. Ericsson says a lot like deliberate practice should not be fun. It should not be enjoyable, and I don't know. I disagree. I find it enjoyable. Yeah. And I think
I
that
have a problem with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that yes, the feeling of frustration is not inherently a good feeling, right? Like, being under the warm covers in the winter, reading a book, like that's inherently a good feeling, right? Struggling with something is not inherently a good feeling, but you can interpret it as a good feeling, right? Yeah. You can, rather than interpreting that feeling as, oh, I'm so terrible, why can't I play this? I'm a terrible musician, I'm so stupid, blah, blah, blah. You can interpret that feeling as, oh, this is what learning feels like. I'm learning right now. I'm getting better. Does it have to be enjoyable? No. Are you going to enjoy it better if you interpret it as something enjoyable? Yes. Yeah. And when we enjoy things, we tend to want to do them more, right? And so then you're going to want to practice more. I think a lot of times students especially don't enjoy practicing because, one, they're not doing it in an effective way, so they're not seeing progress, but also they haven't learned how to reinterpret those feelings of frustration as, this is the feeling of learning. This is what it feels like to get better, and connecting that feeling with then the results that they see.
Of course, and the interesting side of that struggle, again, going back to the neuroscience, this is what produces all the neurotransmitters like norepinephrine and acetylcholine that start to mark all the neurons for change and that sort of thing. So the struggle is actually a good struggle in that it's constructive.
Right. The struggle is necessary. And I think there is this idea that, like, we were talking about talent, this sort of myth that, musicians who are talented can just do it and they just play and everything sounds amazing and you're just having fun and it's I don't know, like that whole myth about like the genius
with
musician.
a bow in the hand.
Right, exactly. And so I think that myth makes people think that every moment of playing your instrument should be the most enjoyable thing you've ever done in your life. No, it's not, right?
It's hard work.
You're wrestling with things and you're working things out, and the person that can go on stage and make it look effortless, they've done that work too, right?
Yes. And the difficult thing is it's a very slow process and very cumulative. And I can understand the frustration in that. You think, oh, I'm getting nowhere with this. And then you say to a student, well, look at yourself 2 years ago. Could you play what you're playing now? Oh, yeah, and I guess this comes back to the growth mindset. You have to see the top of the mountain. You're going to get there. It's just going to enjoy the struggle on the way up.
Right. But you're right. It can be very hard to see your progress in the moment, right? Which is why I think it's important to keep track of your progress. So like you said, you can look back and see, either in old recordings, like listen to yourself. Oh my gosh, I sounded terrible. Like, or, in your practice journal that you can look back and see what you've accomplished, because it is, just like you don't see yourself growing taller when you're a kid growing up, right? You don't every day look in the mirror and be like, whoa, I'm so much taller. But if you compare a picture of you today versus a year ago, like you're a lot taller, right? You're a lot older. And so progress on an instrument is the same thing. It can be hard to see in the moment. Sometimes we have these moments where we make this huge, jump in because something has clicked and like all of a sudden, and those moments are great. But most of the time, it's this slow progress that it's hard to see in the moment, but you look back and you're like, oh, wow, yeah, I have gotten a lot better.
You mentioned the myth of talent. There was the other myth I meant to mention when we were talking about memory. And that's the learning styles myth. You are a certain type of learner, this, that, and the other. Because when I was doing my teacher training, and like I said, this is going back 20 years, this was all the rage. There's visual learners, there's this, auditory learners, kinesthetic learners. And I guess there's a grain of truth to any kind of myth. And you might have a larger percentage like me, for instance, I see sort of, I can see the music when I'm playing, or I see chord diagrams or the chords themselves, quite visual. But so there is that sort of grain of truth. But I think that the mistake that's been made is treating people as a visual learner, then giving them visual things to learn, as opposed to giving them the whole picture, or, as you say, working on their weakest modalities. So.
Right. Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, there are all these different ways of understanding the world, right? Visual, kinesthetic, auditory, many more. And people have different strengths in different areas. I'm also a much more visual learner than an auditory learner. But the mistake that was made is exactly what you said, that, oh, this person's a visual learner. Okay, so they need to learn everything through the visual modality. No, actually, what the opposite of that. This person's a visual learner. Okay, they need to be given things in other modalities because it will be harder for them and therefore they will learn it better. So this is a totally different mindset than, in many Western countries, we see struggle as bad. But actually, you have to struggle, like we were talking about, in order to learn. Yes. And when you are trying to learn something in a modality that is not your strong suit, you will struggle more, and therefore you will learn it more. You will learn it better, and it will stick with you better because you had to struggle to learn it.
That makes total sense. We're going back to desirable difficulty, finding the difficulties in not taking the easy route will produce the most prominent results.
Exactly.
Again, going back to taking breaks, we're sort of heading towards interleaved practicing now. But one of the things that did come out with the Ericsson study was the short amount of time that these students were practicing. The top students, he had a sort of middle group, a top group, and a bottom group. And the top group tend to take a lot more breaks. They'd kind of practice 20 minutes and take a break, come back to another 20 minutes, that kind of thing. So do you think there's for instance, the Pomodoro technique sort of says 25 minutes of intense study, take 5 minutes breaks. It does seem to be like a rule of thumb that crosses a lot of areas. Do you think there's some truth to that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we have to take breaks in order to learn. We tend to think that the majority or all of learning takes place when we are practicing or when we are studying, but actually the learning takes place during the breaks, because in order to learn, your brain has to physically change, like we talked about right at the beginning. And those physical changes largely happen when you are taking a break. So the analogy I often use is with road construction, that if you have to do construction on the road, people can't be driving on it at the same time. You have to shut down the road, do the construction, then open it back up. It's the same thing with your brain. You take a break, that's like shutting down the road. Now your brain can do the reconstruction it has to do. And then you come back to practicing and you're at a higher level because your brain did that necessary construction for you. And so, yeah, that's the first thing. You have to take breaks whether you want to or not, because your brain needs those breaks in order for you to learn. But also, like we were talking about with focus, you can't be really super focused for long periods of time. And if you're not well focused, you're not learning as effectively as you could. And so practicing for shorter amounts of time with longer breaks and more breaks is going to be more effective for two reasons, because you're more focused when you're actually working, and then you're giving your brain a chance to do that reconstruction during the breaks.
Yeah, which is very interesting. There was another recent post by Noah Kageyama, who you know well, of course, and he was talking about micro breaks.
Yeah.
So practice something, then take a couple of seconds just to let it settle in, and then carry on to the next thing, that sort of thing. That's based on a paper. It came out at the beginning. It was like June 8th. It was like the beginning of June. And that paper has created a lot. I've seen lots of people talking about this paper and this research, even though it just came out like less than 2 months ago. They found that when people would take these short little tiny breaks, their brains would replay what they just practiced 20 times faster backwards. Like, why backwards? And that the progress they actually made in doing this, they were doing this button press sequence. The progress was actually made in those little breaks, not when they were actually doing it. Going back to our construction crew again.
Exactly. It's a really cool study. The technology that they used and the way they were able to do this is just so cool. It's an extremely technical study. I had to read it several times to actually understand what they did. I understood the implications and what they found, but to understand actually the technology, I was like, whoa, this is cool. But yeah, the more we learn about breaks, the more we realize their importance. Little breaks, big breaks, all size breaks.
Which brings us beautifully onto interleaved practice. And this was all news to me. And again, this is one of those interesting things. The idea and the studies they've done on interleaved practice have been around for a long time. Mm-hmm. And yet in the guitar world, the bass world, for which I'm obviously a part of, it doesn't seem to be common knowledge. Again, we're back to our block practice, practicing things over again. We need a certain amount of repetition, but isn't it habituation? Is that correct? When
that's the term, yeah.
Just kind of say, I'm done now, which is the danger of repeating things over and over again, for too long.
Exactly. Right, exactly. Yeah, so interleaved practicing and taking breaks, which is often called spaced practice, they are very closely related to each other. So when you interleave your practice, rather than doing thing A for a long time, then thing B, then thing C, you're kind of always rotating between them. Yes. And the rotating serves two purposes. One is you're taking breaks, right? If you're working on A and then you go work on B and C for a while, when you come back to A, you've taken a break from A, right? So part of it is the taking breaks thing, but part of it is when you're constantly switching between things, you're creating what's called contextual interference in your brain, which is,
just crossed that off my list because that was one of my questions.
There we go. So contextual interference is, I think it's actually more, it can be easier to understand what it is in terms of like doing different math problems. And so if you're learning who knows what in math, and there's sort of three different kinds of formulas that you're getting used to, how do you use this? And they're similar, but they're different from each other. If you do like a whole bunch of one kind of problem, and then a whole bunch of another kind of problem, and then a whole bunch of the third kind of problem, that's not going to be as effective as doing like one or two of the first kind, then a few of the second kind, then maybe another of the first kind, then a couple of the third kind, because then you're kind of contrasting them and having to really understand the difference between Formula 1 and Formula 2. When do I use it? How do I use it? Right. And that's what contextual interference is, that your brain has to really figure out the difference between these formulas. And remember, okay, I'm using Formula B now. That means that I have to do X, Y, or Z. So it's the same thing with practicing. If you are switching between different sections of your piece or different skills, you have to, when you come back to a certain skill, your brain has to be like, okay, wait, how do we do this again? How does this go? How is this different from these other things that I was just practicing? And that sort of reminder of your brain of, wait, how do we do this again? That's what helps solidify it in your mind, particularly if you're contrasting it against other things that may be similar but different.
So it's kind of resetting mechanism. And again, the brain likes novelty as well. So
right.
It's a kind of novelty as you move from one thing to. So I guess a good example in the bass world might be 5 minutes walking bass, 5 minutes playing the chords to say a jazz tune, and then 5 minutes playing the melody or soloing over the chords. That kind of
right, exactly. And it's important when you're doing interleaved practice, not just to do each individual skill for a short amount of time, but to come back to the different skills repeatedly, because it's when you come back to it again that your brain has to go through that, wait, how do we do this? And remember, and that's what solidifies it.
That leads me on to an interesting question. And I've heard this a few times. Some people say it's best to start out with something really difficult, then work your way down to easier things. And some people say, no, do something really easy first, just to get yourself on a bit more cheerful about your own progress, and then start working on difficult things. So what do you think about that?
I think it can go both ways. I think both can be effective. You should work on the most difficult things when you have the most focus. And so for me, I'm a morning person. So I'm going to work on whatever is the hardest that I have to practice in that given day in the morning versus like my nighttime practice. I know I'm not going to be as focused then. And so I'm going to leave sort of the easier things for later in the day because I'm not as focused. Yep. Someone who is not a morning person, maybe they will do, right, most people, right? Maybe you will do sort of easier things in the morning because your brain's not quite there yet. And then, in the middle of the afternoon when you're really awake or late at night, who knows, that's when you're going to tackle the really hard things. It may also be that, you, especially in the morning when you're not quite awake yet, you may need a little bit of time to sort of wake your brain up and get back into that mindset of really focused work. So maybe you'll start with some easier things just to get yourself in that mindset and then transition to something harder. And so I think it depends. And I think that you need to keep track on an individual level for yourself. When are you the most focused? When do you get your best work done? And, are you better off when you start with something really hard because you have maximal focus and you get it out of the way and then you can work on easier things? Or do you do better when you have a little bit of easier work at the beginning to kind of get yourself into that hard thing and experiment on yourself and keep track of what works best for you? Because everybody's different in that regard.
Yeah, I can totally see that. So it's very much tailoring things to your own personal ways, as it were. And this, where you mentioned keeping either a video diary or a written diary, I can really see the strengths in that. And there have been so many reports to say, actually, this stuff makes a huge difference
right.
to how you practice and your level of improvement, within that time.
Right. That's absolutely true. Yeah. We need to keep track in some way of what we're doing. And I think students think that with like a practice journal or something, that it's going to be something like super time consuming and they're going to spend all this time. Right. It does not have to be at all time consuming. First of all, it doesn't have to be
500 essay.
No, right. It doesn't have to be neat and clean. You're the only person that's going to see it. So it can be scribbles as long as you can read it. Like that's the most important thing. And, my practice journals, they're full of abbreviations. Nobody else could probably understand what any of them say because I have all sorts of abbreviations for things that I often. Right, exactly. And so, and I'll just make sort of quick notes to myself about either what I worked on or what I need to work on or whatever, so that I am keeping track of it. But it takes like literally 2 minutes. It doesn't take a lot of time.
Brilliant. And keeping track of things brings us nicely onto spaced learning.
Yes.
Now, I'm going to talk about Ebbinghaus, and probably not everybody knows who Ebbinghaus is, but he's the guy in the 1860s, I think.
1880s.
Like 1880s, thank you. And he discovered this drastic drop in trying to learn something new within hours. You'll lose about 60% of what you've been trying to learn, and that will decrease over time. The thing I noticed about that curve and the kind of antidote to that curve is spaced learning. And it seems the best way to space learning is almost an anti-curve, you're following the different directions. So can you tell me, because I noticed you did some quite new videos about this. So can you take me through some of the things you've learned about spaced learning?
Yeah, absolutely. So spaced learning, this is coming back to this idea of taking breaks, and you need to take breaks. And so, this is like really old research, the 1880s, like not new, right? But he discovered, it's called the forgetting curve, that like when something's really new, if you study it once, you're probably not going to remember it, because you forget really easily. And so when you're learning something new, you want your breaks to be relatively short, that you come back and review it a couple times, versus I think what a lot of people do in practicing and studying is they will practice for a big block of time or study for a big block of time and then not come back and review what they studied until the next day or a couple of days. And that's not as effective as say, I'm going to study my vocabulary words for 3 hours. That's a long time. It's going to be way more effective if I did an hour in the morning, an hour in the afternoon, and an hour in the evening, because I'm coming back and I'm reviewing it and I'm reminding my brain, what are these words that I learned? And it's the same thing with practicing. But then as you get better at it and you've practiced it more, if you studied it more, you want to space out those breaks further and further. So you have a chance actually to forget. And then you remind your brain right as it's forgetting, oh yeah, this is that thing, because then you remember it better. Versus, if you just studied it and you study it again, your brain's like, yeah, we know this, that's fine. You're not going to get any additional benefit from that. So yeah, like the opposite of the curve, right? That your breaks are shorter when it's new, and then they get longer and longer and longer as you get better at it.
Which again seems to make sense. So we're almost going back to interleaved practice. The first time you come in contact with this, that the end of your 20 minutes, perhaps revise, take a break, come back to it, then the next day, then 3 days, a week, a month, and space it out like that.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I came up with this. This was my first COVID experiment. This schedule for myself of when I'm going to take my breaks from things to sort of space it out more as I get better at it. Is it the right schedule for everybody? No. Is it a perfect schedule? No. It's just something that works really well for me that I can sort of keep track of and not forget what I'm supposed to be doing.
Well, of course, there's a lot to be said for being your own guinea pig with these scientific research things as well. So one comment that you did make, I thought was really interesting when it comes to all this kind of stuff, especially repetitive practice, block practice. You said our culture of learning just does not work well.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I mean, there's so many things wrong with our culture of learning, but one of the things, talking specifically about spaced practicing, is our culture of learning is you need to sit down and do this one thing for a big block of time. And if you're taking lots of breaks or you're studying for short amounts of time, you're lazy or something. Like, no, that's totally, or practicing, that's totally the opposite of how our brain works. We need to do shorter amounts of time with breaks.